Hey guys, and welcome back to my Golf tutorial series. Today we're just going to cover a few things that'll help you build courses faster and more efficiently, as well as go over some extra customization options for your map. First thing I want to go over is when you select a lane, you'll notice down here in the right corner, you have Move Snap and Angle Snap that show up. And if you select these, they allow you to snap to certain increments. At default, it's 50. But we have certain options here. You can change up to 400 down to just 1. A good thing to keep in mind is 200 is a full lane. You'll snap one full lane at a time. That could be useful if you want, for example, you have a ramp that you want to jump a gap, and you want that gap to be one lane worth, one square, essentially. You can have our move snap turned on, set to 200, and you can move that exactly one lane, and that gives you a gap that you can jump through. Of course, we also have angle snap. If we turn that on, we can select through these different angles. I typically tend to do 45. I usually don't do anything more than that, but if you would like, there's also options for 30, 15, or even 10 or 5. But 45 is great for doing, well, of course, those 45-degree angles. Now, another thing you can do is if you select one of these items and press F to activate your mouse, over here on the left side, you have your location, rotation, and scale coordinates, and you can type any of these in manually. You can also click and drag to move those as well. So for example, if I wanted to have the rotation on the y-axis a certain amount, I can go, say, 36 degrees on the y, and it'll rotate accordingly. Do the same with the scale, any direction I need. You can manually type it in, or you can drag and scale that way as well. Now, you can also multi-select things by holding down Shift, and it'll select multiple items at a time. And in doing so, you can move them together. You can even, holding Alt and copying them, you can copy them together. You can also rotate them together. Keep in mind that when you do this, it'll rotate at the point where your first item is selected at. So in this case, I selected this lane first, so it'll rotate all the objects around that center point. Now, you can also scale things together. However, it's important to keep in mind that when you scale things together, it'll scale along the same axis and not necessarily the same direction. For example, since this lane is rotated, it will not scale in the same direction as these. So it's important to keep that in mind if you're scaling things together. Now, if you need to delete objects, you can simply click on them and press delete on your keyboard, or you can just hover over them and make sure at the bottom here you have the right thing that you want to delete, and just hit delete when you're hovered over the objects. So if you want to customize things a little bit further, right now we have our default grasslands, but if you'd like to change that, if you go into tab here, on the right we have all of our different themes that we can choose from. Those are all maps that come with the game pre-made, so those you can just select one. Let's do, for example, Winterland. The icons will not change in the menu here, but if you have the Winterland selected and you select a lane, you can see it has the Winterland textures. Same with Jade Temple and Deep Blue. You can see they have the textures of those maps. Now, another thing you can do to get really fancy with it, you come down to the custom tab here. You can change these individually. For a lane, for example, we can come into here, we can choose any of these. Let's go with this one. We can change the wall to something else as well. Let's make it the Jade Temple wall. And the pipe, which is things like the hole or pipes or that specific texture, you can change that as well. So let's say if we make it ice, for example. Now here we got a couple of buttons, replace single and replace all. If you replace single, what that does is you can click each one individually and you can change it like that. However, if you select replace all, it'll bring up this little prompt asking if you want to confirm. It'll replace all of the materials in your entire map. So if we click yes, you can see what that does here is it changes all the lanes in the map to be those textures. You can see the ice that we chose for the hole and the pipes, and the other textures that we've chosen for the lanes and the walls. Now, you probably also noticed when we have this menu open, there are two folders. There's custom and default. I've just been using the default ones that come with the game. You can choose any of those. But the custom ones are textures that you can either make or import yourself from the editor. I have a few myself, but I will go more in depth later in a different video going over creating your own textures and materials and things like that. Alright, now the last thing I wanted to go over today was the map settings that you can change. You access those by hitting escape, going into level settings, and by default it'll bring you into the general tab. Here you can change the map name if you want to rename that to something else. You can also change the theme, or you can change the music. The default selected will just play the default music for whatever theme you have. Editor music, of course, is the editor music. You can have none, or you can put the map music. Now create new image. If you have this checked, what you can do is go back and set up a different screenshot, hit escape, and save. Now when you do that, what happens, you go back to level settings, you can see we have an updated picture that is the screenshot that we just took. And it'll also update in the menu as well. So if you update your map, add some stuff to it, you can create a new image so that way you remember. Auto backup time, you can change how often you want it to automatically create a backup in case it goes corrupted or something happens on your PC or anything like that. Workshop ID, this will show up if you upload the map to the workshop. Here you can check that, click save, and remove the workshop ID if you want to change that or re-upload it as a different item altogether. Now the audio tab, here's where you add music and sound to your map. Well, that will involve adding stuff through the importer, which you see I've done here, but I will do a separate tutorial on that later. Now world settings, we have a few different things we can change. First of all, the terrain type. By default, it is voxel, which will allow you to actually edit the terrain and sculpt it using the terrain brush. And again, I'll cover that in a future tutorial. If you want, you can also select just simple plain, or you can turn the terrain off altogether, which you can use for creating sort of like a sky map or a space themed map or something along those lines. Time of day, you can change, time of day. That'll change the shadows, the lighting, things like that. So for this map, I usually like to make my maps sometime later in the day, sort of mid-afternoon to early evening. I like the lighting that sort of gives. The sun angle will just change the rotation of where the sun comes from, which will also change where the shadows are. The light intensity just changes how bright the sun is. Indirect light will change how bright things are, regardless of whether or not there's sunlight or not. If you turn the indirect light all the way down, then the only light source is the sun, and usually that's where you get more harsh shadows and things like that. That can be great if you're going for a more realistic feeling, but if you want something a bit more cartoony, then you might want to add some more indirect light so the shadows are not so harsh. Now scrolling down, we got a few settings for the fog here. So fog density just changes how dense the fog is, pretty self-explanatory. You can also change the color of the fog to anything you'd like. And the fog height fall off, let me adjust the angle here, simply changes how high up in the sky it travels. The max fog opacity is just how dense it can possibly get, depending on how far out you're looking. The fog start distance is just a radius around the player of how far out you want the fog to actually start, which could be useful if you want to see more of the whole, but still have stuff in the distance be in the fog. So as a real map example, I usually like to use fog to give a little bit of atmosphere and realism to my maps. So the height fall off, I'll usually turn that up a little bit. Maybe have the fog density pretty low, and I might change it to something more sky colored, like in this case, maybe a light blue, almost white. The start distance, I'll keep that pretty close as well. You can see that gives a little bit more atmosphere to the map, and it feels like there's really some distance between here and some other places. Now the recommended settings, if you have that checked, that simply just means these are the settings that the map will automatically load up when somebody plays it. So you can change the game mode to classic or hard, practice, any of these. If you do custom, then there's all these different options you can select as well. And you can set the amount of strokes you want to have, time limit for each hole, and collision, just whether or not multiplayer will allow people to collide with each other. And hole spawns just brings up a list of all the holes you've created, and there's a button jump to, which if you click that, it'll take you directly to that hole spawn. And that's useful if you've got a lot of holes going around here, you can't exactly remember where they are, or maybe you've gone far out on the map and don't want to spend all the time traveling back. You can just jump directly to whatever hole you want to do. So with those new world settings applied, you can see if we check out the map here, it's got a lot more dramatic lighting, got some harder shadows as well. It gives it a little bit more character. So that about does it for today's video. Hopefully you learned a couple of things, and go ahead and have fun customizing your map. Make it unique, make it awesome, make it your own. Thanks for watching, I'll see you guys next time.